an exceptionally fascinating time to dig into the US-China relationship. And I can't think of a better person in America to help us think through this puzzle than Bob Zoellick. He has a very distinguished career of public service across several branches of government, including the Treasury Department, the State Department. He was the US Trade Representative, and then he was the director of the World Bank. But Bob is now serving in a variety of capacities, advising people, helping to make sense of US-Chinese politics, and that's what he's going to help us do. Welcome, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Peter, I'm glad to be with you, and glad to be with Melanie and your audience. If you see one of my hands moving, it's because one of my 3 cats has decided to join this educational forum. We have a harmonious household. We have 3 cats and 2 birds. So if we can manage
Listen, if you can manage that, then you can manage US-Chinese relations. So Bob, why don't you get us started? Give us just a scene setter to help us make sense of the times that we're in, and then I'll follow up with some questions.
So when Peter and I discussed this topic, we thought I might start with some comments on a key question, which is, can the US and China cooperate even though they're competitors and represent different value systems amidst increasing acrimony as well? So I'll just start us with 5 points. First, when President Xi assumed office in 2012, he prepared a documentary film about the end of the Cold War. And he required all party cadres, over 88 million people, to see the film. Now, if you had a film like this developed in Europe, it would probably talk about how Gorbachev was a hero that helped end the Cold War. The Chinese version's a little different. In the Chinese version, it's Gorbachev was the fool who abandoned the Communist Party, destroyed his country, led to chaos, and the not so subtle message is it won't happen here. So first point to appreciate is the fall of the USSR, which for many of your students will now be a historical event, casts a very long shadow remaining in China. And even today, if Xi had not been able to shut down the coronavirus coming out of Hubei province, it would have done severe damage to the Communist Party's legitimacy. So that's a background point. Remember, in Chinese history of the different dynasties, big events of disease or famine or crises often signal the end of dynasties. In contrast, while I think there are still some big challenges within China, my view would be today Xi feels that he's had relative success and he's feeling relatively magnanimous in terms of international action. Second point, China's approach going forward is one I've described as globalization with Chinese characteristics. And I focus on 2 tracks. One is to work with the existing institutions of the international order, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the WHO, ITU, UN agencies, which they've been integrated in over the course of decades, but to push those institutions more towards Chinese interests and norms. This really shouldn't be a surprise. All countries do it to a degree. You could ask a question of whether the United States is actually engaging in those institutions effectively to promote its interests. But there's a second track also worth watching. Scholars of China will talk about the history of tributary states and how China views other countries through a tributary states framework. In some ways, they've modernized that concept, which is to show economic benefits to other countries, to help other countries, as long as the other countries show respect to China, certainly don't criticize the Communist Party. Belt and Road as a model of Chinese infrastructure-led development is a good example of that. And I think you'll see this take additional form in the context of pandemic. Third point about US politics in China. I think from the start, President Trump had a confrontational approach. It tended to be focused on a narrower topic of the bilateral trade deficit. And leading into this pandemic, he worked out a purchase package. It was a package to purchase a lot of things, not so much to adjust and change rules. I think I and others somewhat questioned the likelihood of the results before the pandemic, but I think that deal is now really a historical factor. Um, Other Republicans joined the chorus and in a sense brought in sort of other voices, criticizing human rights, internal policies, external behavior, security, economics, the Wuhan virus, as is said by Secretary Pompeo in the context of the pandemic. The strategic objective of these complaints isn't really clear. Is it to decouple? Is it just to throw insults? It's not clear where the direction is. The Democrat response is also worth paying attention to, and that is from their historical record in the Cold War, they don't want to be seen as soft on China. So Peter, you and perhaps some of your students that watch these journals like Foreign Affairs, you'll see a lot of mea culpa. So, oh yes, I've learned my lesson. And there's of course a strain of protectionism in the Democratic Party. I suspect if Biden wins the presidency, he would try to be more multilateralist in his approach, but it's not really clear what his objectives would be. So that's somewhat fuzzy as well. Fourth point, in the background of the politics in the United States, there's a new conventional wisdom that has crept into the analysis, and that is the years of cooperation with China failed. I shared with you an article I wrote for the National Interest in which I argue that whatever you think going forward, that presumption is flat wrong. And just to touch on some of this, keep in mind, I was born in 1953, right about the time that China was still a wartime enemy in Korea. And some of that we've changed to, frankly, a big turn on helping with issues of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and missiles. Very big change in the policies from the 80s to the 90s going forward. Cooperation with the United States on Iran and North Korea. Of the some 190 UN Security Council resolutions that involve sanctions, China agreed with about 182 of them, although these often took some diplomatic labor. China's active in UN peacekeeping. I did a lot of work in Darfur in the early 2000s. China was actually quite helpful in that context. On the economic side, China is the biggest contributor to global economic growth. It had a very large current account surplus of about 10%. That is about reduced to zero right before the pandemic. So that means that Chinese demand was helping others grow. It was the fastest growing destination for US exports for 15 years. It no longer manipulates the exchange rate. It's involved with humanitarian efforts. I do work with Mercy Corps, and Mercy Corps is actually connected with some of the Chinese groups that started out doing emergency work, and now Mercy Corps is working with them to try to expand the nature of their humanitarian efforts. Even in the World Trade Organization, the WTO accession in 2001, which I completed, if you look, there's a lot of debate about this, but if you look at actually the numerical commitments, first, China's commitments were far more significant than that of other developing countries such as India and Brazil. They by and large kept the numerical commitments. The frustrations have been with some of the harder to handle measures, such as do you enforce your intellectual property. In climate change, if you melt the glaciers in the Himalayas, it's going to be very, very bad for China. So you see, on the one hand, they still have coal-fired plants, but they had a lot of technology innovation in terms of alternatives. In the conservation community where I've been active, they won a lot of fans by banning elephant ivory. The netizen community attacked shark fin soup. They're not doing enough on tigers, which is another issue of mine. But these are all examples of cooperation producing some mutual gains. Even with the difficult issue of use of force, keep in mind, the really only examples you have of China using force were Vietnam in 1980, and then some dust-ups in the Spratlys. Even Taiwan, where there's a lot of sensitivity about the treatment. My point with all of these is don't take the restraint for granted, including in the case of Taiwan. Now, this I also don't mean to mistake that all is well. There are a lot of challenges. There are many complaints. And frankly, what that experience suggests to me is there's no holidays from the work of diplomacy. You just have to keep plugging along on these issues. But I do believe that cooperation can produce results. So that leads me to the final point. Can the US focus on interests and also stand for its values? And I believe the answer to that is yes. However, it's important to go back and identify what the problems are you're really trying to address. So for example, I talked about some of these in the article. There are issues of traditional trade, reciprocity, technology theft, intellectual property rights. Then there's a similar but related problem of, can state capitalist institutions compete fairly? Because the ownership by the Chinese state sector. By the way, a lot of those state-owned enterprises don't perform very well, so they're kind of drags on the Chinese economy. Then there's a deeper fear about technology dominance. There's a question about Belt and Road. Is it a geopolitical venture, a development venture? As I suggested, I think it's all of those with a sort of a Chinese model. And also foreign and security policies. Now, you can take that set, come up with your own set. Whatever set you come up with, I doubt that higher tariffs alone, which has been the prime approach of the administration, is going to be able to match up very well with each of these. And for each of these problems, it doesn't mean that all goes well. You probably have a combination of negotiation, deterrence, trying to make arguments that appeal to constituencies within China, building coalitions with outsiders. And if I could bring that to the issues of today, how do you really expect to deal with issues like pandemics or climate change or proliferation or the health of the international economy unless you figure out some way to work with China? Now that raises the question of values, which has also been traditionally an important part of US foreign policy. One that I might say the Trump administration has not given a high preference to. The first point, of course, is the best thing the US can do is be an example at home. So what we do at home is the best sort of foreign policy message that we can send around the world. But I know, given some of your work, Peter, historically, and some of mine as well, it's interesting to look at a comparison, say, with Ronald Reagan with the Soviet Union. Reagan had this ability to seek cooperation. At the same time, he spoke out about American principles and values. Now, one of his methods was he talked about the aspirations of the Russian people, whether it was religious freedom, whether it was political freedom, whether it was economic enterprise. He didn't try to use the comments as insults. He tried to use them as a way of saying, of course your people will want this. Of course this is the direction that they want to go. And he actually became quite popular in the Soviet Union by the time that he left office, because he was seen as speaking truth in the nature of the system. So I think whether it's expressing positions on Hong Kong or Taiwan or events in Zhejiang province, there are ways that the United States can stand for these values. We should stand for these values at the same time that we can try to work with China on cooperation. And what some of this does come down to the basics of diplomacy, which people often ignore amidst their articles, which is listening, treating people with respect, finding some common ground. And I'll just close with this example. You mentioned when I was president of the World Bank. Whenever I would go to China, and I would not only visit Beijing, but I would always go to see some of the projects in different provinces. That was first off appreciated, that I was not just going to the big cities, that I was also going all around the country, seeing the earthquakes in Sichuan and others. But when I came back to Beijing, I always had a press conference. And these press conferences were very, very well attended, because the types of questions that the Chinese journalists could ask me were very different than they would ask their officials. I always tried to be quite open, take whatever comment people asked, and even on one late in my tenure, when we did a report called China 2030 about the nature of the reform process, which we had done with the Chinese government actually, there was a demonstrator that stood up and complained about the position we had on state-owned enterprises. Security guards started to come in. The journalists thought, oh, well, this guy's going to get hauled off. And I stopped the guards and I said, no, let him ask his question. And first off, I think the questioner was shocked that he got to ask his question. But then I took it in a serious way and I tried to respond on serious points. And so, part of this is also, don't presume that people in China also don't see some of the faults of the system. They may respect what it's produced for them economically. They may fear chaos. There's different historical aspects. But for the long term, what you need to do if you're a US or an international official is to try to treat people respectfully, but also push your position and your values. And the last closing point I'll make is, as people debate their arguments with China, these are all reasonable, many frustrated points, including, for example, the origins of this pandemic and what we'll learn from that. But I urge people to keep in mind the consequences of a breakdown. The destabilization of decoupling, which people seem to talk about in sort of loose terms, could be enormously destructive, not only for the two countries and for the world. And for your students, I think this will be one of the, if not the key issue for their generation.
So this is great. This is a rich menu, a Chinese banquet of issues. I feel like we should be toasting now to make our way through this. But let me just begin by asking this question. If you and I were talking 15 years ago, I would say what you shared would probably be close to the bipartisan consensus. You advanced a concept, responsible stakeholder, which had appeal. It was a way of viewing China's rise in power as not a threat, but an opportunity. And I would say both parties, at least the center elites of both parties, were willing to go along with that. Now that optimistic view is much more in the minority, and I would say there's almost a bipartisan consensus that it's time to get tough on China. So without going blow by blow, what do you think is the most important factor that persuaded so many others that we've been taken advantage of? Was it Xi Jinping's assertiveness in the South China Sea, or his manhandling of China on the rare earth, or what do you think were the factors?
I think there's been a combination of factors, but let me set the context, and particularly for your students understanding diplomacy, I think this is perhaps a useful aspect. Keep in mind when you're a public official, as opposed to a scholar or analyst, you're trying to get things done. And when I gave that speech in 2005, we had a world where China had come into the WTO. They were a member of the UN Security Council, they're part of the IMF and World Bank. And I was trying to draw attention to what should be the next stage of US priority. And a way to think about it is not just the forms, but what would be the norms of behavior. So they were integrated. And the question is, what do you want them to do? How do you want to press them to act constructively? Now, having said that, it is the case that if you're going to work with a country on those types of within systems, it's kind of the first track that I was referring to about the globalization with Chinese characteristics. You have to be willing to listen and see what ideas they bring. I will say that in things like the global financial crisis, the Chinese brought the best stimulus, the biggest stimulus programs, a lot of different support. So, I'm of the view that China can also bring things to the table. Some people won't have that view. I think what happened was that in each of the areas that I sort of touched on, the business community felt that some of the trade openness wasn't fair enough, or the stolen technology or intellectual property rights, a degree of reciprocity. There was an anxiety about state-owned enterprises. Xi Jinping in 2012, I think, definitely was part of this because he moved away from the Deng Xiaoping view of bide your time, hide your strength. He was being sort of more brash. Within China, he actually got some criticism of this as well. And so I think there's and the pandemic, people will talk about where the virus started. There are fair questions to ask about the nature of the information, how quickly they turned it over. If you're in the conservation community, as I am, the nature of some of these markets with what sort of wildlife. So I think there was a set of different things that led to that. Plus, I think an uncertainty within the US about the US role and the strength that we had. But what I would urge people to bring back to the point is, okay, so how do you expect to get things done? And so it's interesting when you see people, even people who criticize responsible stakeholder, if you see what they're saying, they said, I want China to do this. I want China to do that. I want China to take this responsibility. It actually verges back into the same model of China assuming responsibilities in its role. And here, I think a lot of the Chinese figured this out, but some of the American commentators, I don't think ever quite grasp this. I don't see how the US could lose if we basically say, we want to encourage China to do more, and in effect, we'll be the judges of whether they do more or not. Now, from the Chinese side, was a plus, and it treated them with respect and standing. But I'm happy to treat people with respect and standing if I can move them more towards our policies. Your question is particularly apt now, because in some ways, President Trump has actually, I think, dialed back some of the acrimony because he wanted his trade deal. As I said, I don't think his trade deal is going to amount to much, but also I think in the present pandemic environment, you notice he's not talking about Chinese virus because he realizes that his reelection depends on how we get out of this and the economic recovery. More disruption is not going to be good for doing that. But whether it's on the Republican or the Democratic side, I think going in, whoever is the next president, they don't really have a plan about how they want to try to deal with China. And at least what I suggested, I think there's a way you can do that while also recognizing the nature of the Chinese regime. So remember what I started out with Xi Jinping and the role of the Communist Party. He's worried about not ending up like the Soviet Union. So you need to keep that in mind if you're working with him.
So I am more gloomy or pessimistic, let me put it that way. I'm more pessimistic about the prospects in the short run for the following reason. I agree with you that some minimal cooperation with China is necessary to get out of this well. And there was an Asian Society, one of those letters, I signed that. I noticed you didn't sign that. I was expecting.
I get asked to sign letters almost every week, and so instead I rely on conferences like this one.
Okay, that's fair enough. But the thrust of that letter was we have to cooperate with China to get out of this mess, basically. You can't get out of this mess by bashing China. However, as we get closer to November, I think the temptation to criticize China from the administration side will be irresistible because they will be facing a sharp message of critique from Vice President Biden saying, you got us into this mess. And Trump is going to have to say, no, not me, they, China, pointing to China. And how, am I wrong? That would seem to be irresistible to the president in that moment.
I think putting myself in President Trump's mind is a dangerous thing to do. I might not get out, but I think there's two dimensions of this. One, as I suggested, he has extraordinarily good political instincts, and he was going to be running on a strong economy and attacking his opponents as democratic socialists. In fact, he's still trying to do that today. I think he made it, and that's, I think, actually explained some of the early reluctance to accept the pandemic because that was going to disrupt that. Right. I think he's recognized that that approach won't work. And so instead, this election will be a referendum on his performance with health and economics. And former Vice President Biden said of best alternative, including from some of my Democratic friends would say, is to look like a serious adult that could lead the country because it's going to be a referendum on Trump. If it's a referendum on Trump, he wants to be careful about taking steps with China that create further anxiety in markets, create a sense, a lot of our medical supplies come from China. Does he really want to create a provocation? And on the other side, as I mentioned quickly, I think Xi is in a state of mind where he wants to try to act in a more generous capacity. You can see they're sending health supplies at all different locations. They're working out with governors or with Germany or Canada or others. I do think your point is right that as he gets near the end and one has to blame somebody, there will certainly be a lot of blaming of China. And separate from President Trump, you'll hear this from the Congress. You're hearing this now. And as I suggested, on the Democratic side, Biden won't want to look soft on China. So the real question is what follows. Now, that really, those are the choices of governance that people will be debating. I think what I'm trying to suggest is that whatever you like or don't like about China, you have to accept the reality that it's not going away. I don't think a decoupling strategy or developing an autarkic United States is going to be very good for us, much less them. I do think an alternative approach could be more effective at working with other parties. So you mentioned the letter. One of the things I noted in the letter is it again tended to make it US and China. And I and a couple of other people thought, well, you actually should make this US-China working with others, Europe, Japan, other players. And I think a more effective US strategy could build support on some of the things that are we don't like about China, or treatment of people in Hong Kong or other issues. And you can also find voices within China. This is that will make some of these points. A lot when I worked on economic reform issues within China and got changes, part of the argument is to explain how some of these changes are going to be in their own self-interest. Keep in mind, in this economic response in China, they relied very heavily on the state-owned sector. It's understandable. It's the tool at hand. That probably will put them in a more difficult position for the next stage of reform, because they've already relied too heavily on state enterprises. The return on assets of state-owned enterprises are much lower than the private sector. A lot of credit and capital has been going to the state-owned enterprises sector. So they're relying on a tool that could actually disadvantage them. So I think that what I would emphasize in the core of the policy is identify the problems that you feel are most important to solve. I flew through some of those, and some of those are in the article that I mentioned, and try to develop coalitions with other countries, and also, frankly, within parties in China, to try to make progress on some of those problems. And so it's not, whether you sort of accept the Chinese regime in all its political system, but also the bottom line is, if you come back to where you started, okay, so let's confront China. Well, so what's that going to produce for us? And by the way, for people that know the rest of the world's not going to cut off China. Southeast Asia is not going to cut off China. Japan's not going to cut off China. Korea's not going to cut off China. European Union's not going to cut off China. So the idea, when people talk about analogies to containment, as in the Soviet Union, I think those are very faulty.
So let me mention another actor, though, that could get involved, or other two sets of actors. One is Congress, and the other is states attorney general. Either one or both of which could say, if China is to blame for the pandemic, we need to recoup some of the losses from the pandemic. And you can imagine lawyers viewing that as a case worth taking. And you can certainly imagine members of Congress viewing that as a bill worth naming, or sponsoring. So, first of all, is there any merit to that kind of critique? And even if there's no merit, is there a risk that it would show up in a campaign season and complicate the approach you're describing?
It could. And when I try to explain the American system to people in Europe or Asia, one of the things I emphasize is you've got a great diversity of political players. And as I wrote in this piece in the Wall Street Journal this week, don't forget the private sector as well. State attorneys general are often in that office because they would like to be governor, and they need litigation to sort of get attention. On the other hand, you'll find a lot of governors and mayors are actually the better political officials to work with foreign investors, whether they be Chinese or German or Japanese or others, because they bring jobs. And I don't think it's an accident, nor is it a bad thing now that China is actually working with a number of those states to make sure they get the medical supplies. A huge amount of this is produced in China. Now, there's a sub piece of this, which I do think that both at a country and a company level we'll have to deal with. And that is, what degree of dependency do you want to have in certain areas from certain producers? Now, that's, in a sense, the Peter Navarro idea of running the Defense Production Act is we should produce it all here. Well, that's going to be very hard to do. It's going to be very costly. And frankly, it's going to hurt all of American export industries, including farmers, which tend to be rather important for a lot of states for their electoral parts. On the other hand, will you see more diversity of sourcing? I think so. More understanding of how supply chains get disrupted? Definitely. Will you see more attention to stockpiling and inventories? For certain. So I believe that the globalization, if you will go through adaptations. I believe it's a fact of life. It's not really a choice to whether you can keep it or not. But as a starting point, where the U.S. can get a lot of strength and traditionally got a strength is also to work more closely with partners. So just to take a real recent incident, the Navarro used this Defense Production Act to order 3M to send all of the materials that the protection materials that were being produced in China and elsewhere to the US, where 3M wanted to send about a total of 10% to Canada and to Germany and Latin America. And 3M protested. Well, for people who watch this closely, you'll see that Prime Minister Trudeau didn't complain directly, but he said, I'll talk to the president about this. Well, it just so happens that a lot of the materials that go into the US equipment come from Canada. So why do we want to pick a fight with Canada? Or by the way, the second largest supplier of these materials is Mexico. So do we really want to sort of create a trade conflict with Mexico for whatever the topic has been? Do we want to discourage investment in Mexico, which will actually produce these materials? So traditionally, one of the US strengths, as you know, Peter, is that by being an open society, trying to lead on these issues, and everybody doesn't always agree where we lead, but they want to sort of have a sense of somebody focused on the problem, we're able to build coalitions. We're able to pull people together. And that's a missing part of our foreign policy.
But we're also a litigious society. So do you not see any risk on this lawsuits and that would finger China for blame? Is that?
Well, I was once actually a lawyer and actually clerked on the Federal Court of Appeals in the DC Circuit. So I guess what I would have to ask is, what's the statute? What, and is it a state claim? Then is there a federal preemption? So there are a lot of, I don't deny that people may bring the suits in part to look active. I guess I don't know enough about the nature of the claims to know how successful they will be. And at the end, again, from a national point of view, yeah, so how are you going to collect against China? I mean, so now you get and will you collect by trying to sort of take control of some of their assets in the United States? Well, how's that going to help, in terms of the companies that are investing in creating jobs there? So we're in an age, it's always the case, I suppose, where a lot of first order, I don't like this, let me figure out a way to slap somebody, may have a surface appeal, but when you start to take it 2 or 3 steps down, my approach on policy over many years has been, what are the results? What am I going to accomplish?
So you mentioned that the trade deal, which the president was pretty close to, launching with great fanfare, whatever it was going to be, looks to be dead in the water for the time being. Do you think that something will be cobbled together before November so that the president has something he can point to on the trade? There's been a lot of Sturm und Drang in the U.S.-Chinese trade area and not a lot of resolution yet. So tell me what you think about that.
Even before the pandemic, if you look at good analyses, for example, Chad Bowen at the Peterson Institute of International Economics has done some good work on this. I've drawn on some of it for pieces that I've written in the Wall Street Journal or others. The numbers were quite questionable about what they were going to achieve. And again, as I said, the key point was, unlike most trade agreements, which try to set rules to allow people to compete fairly, this one was they're supposed to purchase X or purchase Y. And the types of growth that would have been required was questionable. And also it was actually it didn't cover all the US exports. It only covered maybe 70, 80%. So you're going to get diversion. You're going to get the fact that China might buy some more of this, but sort of less of this, and they'll buy less of Brazilian soybeans, but then the market price for soybeans is going to be determined globally. So it was kind of a jerry-rigged operation from the start. There were some rule changes in there. As I also suggested, China made some changes, and this is the way I would approach things, that were in its own interest, but in our interest as well. They have an aging population. As part of their financial markets, they're trying to develop better asset management systems. So you'll see that sort of BlackRock or others, Fidelity, they're trying to move into that market. Part of the agreements that had been in the works was to allow those companies to have full ownership of these their firms, as opposed to the 49% ownership. And so the nature of economics, fortunately, is you can find win-win solutions on a number of these approaches. So I think the deal itself had serious weaknesses, but for the very reason that the president concluded it, I think he will also figure out a way to say it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I think China will try to make purchases from the United States, help make it try to look good. The nature of the deal was you would never know in 2020 anyway. So he'll keep saying what it would be. And I haven't seen him to be too shy about making forecasts, whether they're truthful or not.
Well, one of the crucial metrics, though, would be the tariffs. And so here I'm going to see if I can optimistic you and say, I'm going to suggest, isn't it possible that the president will find in reducing the tariffs an opportunity in the current crisis to say, okay, I need to remove drags on the economy, and so declare victory and reduce tariffs more than he otherwise would have, just because he needs to get the economy moving again. That argument, which may have been less persuasive last year when the economy was humming along, may feel more persuasive now. Is that too optimistic?
I think so. We have a partial test. So to your argument, they have temporarily removed some of the tariffs on some of the medical areas. It's a piece that I wrote about, some of the medical equipment.
Right.
Certainly didn't make sense to, at the time we're struggling to get these PPE materials, to protective materials, that they actually charge more for them. And we've had a number of companies apply to the Commerce Department and others for exclusions, for inputs and others. They've been somewhat cautious and reluctant on how much they're going to do. And that goes to the second point, where the difference of some political experience plus the policy. Keep in mind, President Trump, in my view, won election because he was an outsider that challenged the system. And he wanted to demonstrate to a political base he was different than other politicians. And he found some very core issues that connected with them. One was the wall with Mexico and immigration. Another was trade protectionism. Frankly, a third is, you know, trying to get out of foreign wars. And a fourth was whatever his predecessors did, he'll have to do it differently. So they didn't deal with North Korea, he will. If they dealt with Iran, he has to get out of it. But if you take the immigration and the trade issues, Trump's authenticity with that political base is very important. So there will be industries that would be very upset if he removed the tariffs and protections. And personally, as you said, going into an election, I think he's going to be most concerned about demonstrating to his political base his authenticity and how he can be relied on. So to take another example, I've been emailing with a friend, you know, I think there's a fair chance that we will remove forces out of Afghanistan before the election, even though the terms of the deal would not be met.
So let me ask you about another China that has also weathered the pandemic in arguably much better than big China has, Taiwan. Taiwan is one of the countries that seems to have had the most success in coming through this, probably because of their earlier experience with pandemics. Does that complicate Taiwan's role in the U.S.-China relationship, where it's often a thorn that can't be mentioned, and yet Taiwan is a success story in some respects?
Well, clearly you don't plan to visit China soon, since you called Taiwan a country as opposed to an economy.
Fair enough.
But I think Taiwan is an important part in the past and looking forward. Just to give you some background on this, way back in the 90s when I was in the Bush 41 administration, and we created APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. In 91 and 92, after Tiananmen Square, we managed to bring Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China into APEC because China wanted to be brought into the international system, and it was a way to bring sort of Taiwan in, and it was trying to connect China or Taiwan economically. I completed the WTO accession for China in 2001. A lot of people forget we also brought in Taiwan at the same time. My approach on this has always been that, and it goes back to the point about don't take things for granted. We want to try to respect and complement the open society and democracy in Taiwan. We want to try to make sure as best it can be connected with the economic system. But don't mislead ourselves. In other words, if Taiwan declared independence for some of the historical reasons that we touched on, Xi Jinping and China would be forced to respond. And you do a lot of work with the US military, some serious questions about our ability to defend Taiwan. There's also leads to questions about the type of Taiwan's defense components. So I think, in a way, as in the United States, the best way that Taiwan can shine is by doing a good job. And by demonstrating, for example, that the WHO should be able to include Taiwan in different ways,
Exactly.
Given the sort of example. There's a bigger question about the nature of the WHO and some of its problems, some of which are inherent in its structure, not just the current leadership. And so, as for the politics, which you also hit it on, people will undoubtedly want to highlight support for Taiwan. What I would just caution is go back and look at the dialogues between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai and Mao at the time of the opening to China in 1970, 71. At that time, China basically said, well, we can let Taiwan settle this, we'll deal with this over. It's been 50 years. I actually suspect that some in China might have expected Taiwan to come closer to home by now. Instead, Taiwan, fortunately, has prospered as an open democracy. And this is where the Hong Kong issue, this shows the interconnectedness of this. The Hong Kong was supposed to be the model of one country, two systems. And Beijing also looked upon that model as one that would apply to Taiwan. I don't think that model is going to be very appealing to Taiwan sort of going forward, but this is not missed in Beijing either. So these are the types of issues that you have to decide how far are you willing to push. You can stand for something, you can promote something, you can help, as I tried to do with Taiwan and various organizations. But on the other hand, if you're talking about pushing it to the limit of Taiwan independence, I think you better be ready for a military conflict. And then you have to ask whether the people in North Carolina or other states are willing to have their sons and daughters go to war for that.
Another issue you didn't mention, but it would be on that list of thorny topics, the treatment of the Uyghurs out in the western part of China. These, if the pandemic hadn't happened and you were able to have come to Duke on schedule as planned, we would have spent a lot of time on the Uyghur issue, on Hong Kong, on South China Sea, things that we just haven't had time to talk about. The pandemic hasn't removed those. It's just put them on a back burner. But once we come out of the pandemic, they return to the front burner, possibly. That's my supposition. Which of those issues is the one you think we will have the hardest time, the United States will have the hardest time reaching accommodation with China on?
Well, I think all those issues will be in this murky soup of sort of politics and human rights and frustrations with China. I think you need to deal with them each on their own terms. So take Hong Kong. I think the US position on Hong Kong should be that China should respect the deal that it struck with Britain and preserving the rule of law system. And we should also warn China, we don't have to do it in a hostile way, but I think we need to be blunt, that if they really crack down on Hong Kong in a serious, violent way, there would be a huge price to be paid for partly the political reasons, not just with the United States, but with others around the world. So we want to try to do what we can to sort of steer away from that course. At the same time, recognize that the turnover in 1997 gave Taiwan certain voting rights, certain rule of rights, but it isn't an independent country and it's not a pure democracy. So that's how I think the goal with Hong Kong is to try to preserve its unique status, that it should be in everybody's interest, and not have China by any means take any steps that would try to have it lead to a brutal suppression, which would hurt everybody. With the Uyghurs and others, part of the problem is we now don't have relations with China where you can have quiet conversations with where they know that the American on the other side isn't necessarily hostile to them, but actually can bring ideas. Again, I've done this over 30 years. I found Chinese can be very challenging, difficult set of partners, but there's actually a relative openness to listening to ideas and change. And on the Uyghurs, if they create a dystopia for, you know, 1 billion people, how's that going to end up sort of helping them going forward? How will that look in the rest of the world? And will it end up leading to the Uyghurs being more healthy contributors into Chinese society? And again, just to give you a practical example, I had this discussion with the Chinese on religious freedom years ago. I made the point that as people did better economically, it would be natural they would start to look to different spiritual aspects. And it would be really dumb for China to try to make sort of religion and spiritual feelings of people against the state. Now, as you probably know, this is where one needs to have a sense of Chinese history. With some of those dynasties I mentioned, some of these religious movements, whether it was the Taiping Rebellion or others, sort of created great anxiety for the ruling authorities. So they're very sensitive to these points. But I think with the Chinese, one should make the arguments about why these policies that they're doing are counterproductive. And then publicly, we should speak about why we believe they're counterproductive. We don't have to use it in a way just as a way to try to insult China, but we should say these are the beliefs and the things we stand for.
Okay, I'm going to ask my last question, and then we'll move to the audience questions. And my question is this: if you're sitting in Xi Jinping's chair, and you're looking at the choice, Trump or Biden, which of those do you think he would view as more easy to work with, more able to do deals with? President Trump or Vice President Biden? Put another way, does China have a dog in this campaign? And at
well,
least
your last question made it easier, because I think China will be very careful, unlike Russia perhaps, to be seen as messing around in the U.S. elections, because the chance of discovery and the blowback would be very, very high. And I don't think it's in the Chinese interest to do that. Going back to your first question, I actually was at another video conference this morning with some international partners asking the same question. And I don't think there's an easy answer. On the one hand, I think the Chinese tend to like to know the partner they know, and I think they feel that they understand some of Trump, his narcissism, kind of his ego, how to work that. But they've also learned that he can be impulsive, and he can do things that are disruptive. I think this trade deal that they cut was, frankly, in their view, they managed to sort of manipulate it to a degree. And so on the one hand, I think they can deal with him. Nobody knows what it'll really be like in a second term. If you really want to be Machiavellian on this, you could also say that they feel that Trump is undermining the U.S. position around the world, and that doesn't sort of hurt them so bad much. In the case of Biden, he's would carry some of the same sort of political impulses that we've talked about in the system. I think that at the margin, they might feel that a Biden administration is a little bit more predictable. And in that sense, it has some advantages, but they're kind of offset by the idea of, well, we've figured out how to deal with Trump. But the bottom line is, I honestly think the last thing that they want to do is get caught in the process of U.S. elections. And again, remember where I started, Peter. It's why I started with these opening points. You know, the dealing with this pandemic in the first stage was really quite a political crisis for this administration in China. I mean, Xi Jinping had really taken on a lot of power on himself. He was really seen as running the place. Given the size of that population, if you'd had it spread to, other provinces in a big way, we even saw a little bit in the netizen community, the nature of the Chinese sort of reaction. So we'll see what happens there'll be other waves of this. We'll see what happens, how they recover. But I think he basically feels he dodged a bullet. And right now, he feels that compared to what's going on in the US and Europe, China looks like it's managed the problem. Now, China uses methods and others that others couldn't take. I think they're overdoing the propaganda, and some of this will come back to hurt them in different places. But the bottom line is, and this goes a lot to the question about, can you work with China? They don't want a confrontation with the United States. China, as someone who's worked on the development of China and other countries, China still has a lot of internal problems, whether there be debt issues, the structural issues, a lot of poor people, the demographics. If you're sitting in Beijing, as you said, in that chair and thinking about the agenda for China, it's no simple set of tasks to conduct. And he doesn't really need a fight with the United States now. Whether 10 or 15 years from now, China will be positioned better and less able to have to defer to the United States. Those are the questions why we need to be thinking about your grand strategy.
Well, great. And we've got some great students who are thinking about this. So up first is Elise Bousquet.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. It was very informative. I was wondering, you mentioned how it's important for in terms of American diplomacy to stand up for our values in a respectful manner. Considering the coercive power of China's economy, how do you think that translates to the American private sector? Do you think it's the responsibility of American companies to also stand up for American values? And how can they do that when China's sort of retaliatory measures are so strong historically?
Yeah, excellent question. I think that any company, US, European, or others, needs to think not only about the bottom line of doing business in China, it also has to think about its relations with employees. It has to think about its position with customers. And therefore, I think the critical aspect is for companies to be transparent about what they're doing and why. So some of the technology companies encountered this, 5 or 6 years ago when there were intrusions in the system. I can understand their desire to try to do business in those societies, try to still move it to more open connectivity with others, but they need to be clear with their users about the risks that they're running. In terms of whether you decide to do business in China or not, I think what you've actually seen over the past couple of years is some of the factors that I've mentioned, economic and political, have led many companies to seek greater diversification anyway. And the trade issues and now coronavirus will really expand that. Now that leads to a next order question. If you move your business from communist China to communist Vietnam, how is that doing on the values? So in a sense, I don't think you can escape those issues. And I think it's always been true, but I think more than in the past, CEOs and boards of companies have to figure out what balance that they strike on those topics. In a way, just as on the diplomatic side, you have to strike a balance. It is possible, I think, for some of these companies to also work with China on the benefits of a rules-based system, to show how they treat their employees. There are benefits of doing business with China, but you also shouldn't fool yourself with the nature of the regime that you're dealing with, which is why I started with the first point that I did about Xi Jinping.
Can you name names? Is there a company that you think has done it really well, or a company that's done it poorly? Or if
I would just
undo them.
No, I think the key is that first off, it's important to recognize how important China is to some of these companies that in the United States. So if you look at GM or Ford, or if you looked in Germany with some of the car companies, this is a very important part of their market. And that also then means, what sort of returns do you want to have to their investors, the pensions, the savings funds. I think without naming individual companies, I'll leave you with this thought. that is actually applies to many countries in the developing world. Many business people in the United States kind of thought, well, markets are the normal course of business, and if you can do business in markets and make money as long as you follow the rules, you do what you wish. In developing countries, and particularly in China, one needs to recognize markets are a means to an end. They're not an end in and of themselves. And so when you're dealing with China, it's important, if you're an insurance company, for example, to talk about how this would help with risk management or savings for the elderly or some of the catastrophic aspects. If you're an information technology company, or in the case of some of the biological efforts, I think there's there've been a generation or more of people that have gone across the Pacific and studied at US universities, created venture capital funds and others. So I think there are important sort of mutual gains. I would be reluctant to try to give them up. And frankly, if the US cut itself off, trust me, everybody else would not anyway. But as the question asked, and that's why it's a good question, some executives in the past thought, well, they can just sort of ignore these parts and do business. I don't think as an executive you can do that anymore.
Okay, next question from Achille Javeri.
Hi, how are you? Thanks so much for being with us. My question is basically like, how does the rest of the world view this, I don't know, U.S.-China relationship conflict, and like what interests do they have? Like, what do they wish to see happen with this relationship? Yeah, and like, do they like view like, I guess, President Trump's like foreign policy of like kind of like isolationism and like retreating from like multilateral institutions as like stable for their interests, or like stuff like that?
So good set of questions. To start out, they're scared. And if you take countries, particularly in the rest of Asia, they want to have a good relationship with China and one with the United States. They don't want to have to choose. And as some of them, I think the Singapore Prime Minister, who's a good friend of the US, Singapore is a married part for the US Navy, have said quietly, don't force us to choose. You may not like the answer you get. They all have to deal with these sort of the realities. So there's a great sense of anxiety and frustration, in a sense that the US has actually missed opportunities to work with others to focus on some of the common complaints with China. Europe and Australia and others have had some of the same economic frustrations. Some of the best work about the difficulties of some of the Chinese state-owned development and technology plans came from the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing. And so there's a uncertainty about why the United States has sort of abandoned the idea of trying to work with others in the past. Then you have another concern, which is when the US does bilateral trade deals, not on rules, but on purchase agreements, then countries are worried, well, who's going to get left out on this? If the Chinese buy from the US, does that mean they're not buying from Brazil? Does that mean that that Canada or Australia or others? So where your question sort of fits is that without trying to be, overly hostile about this, the administration's approach to alliances and partners and the structure built up over 70 years has left a lot of countries in shock. And some of them are having to come up with plan Bs, and some of these plan Bs people need to reflect on. I mean, the nuclear umbrella the United States provides. If you're in Japan or South Korea these days, do you think that there are planning units somewhere deep in those bureaucracies thinking about whether they may need to develop sort of nuclear capacities? Japan has got a nuclear China, a nuclear Russia, a nuclear Korea, North Korea. I'm not predicting this, but I'm saying these are where you could start to disrupt things. I'll close at this point. While it's the notion of a paradigm, but it's at least give you some historical reference point. if the United States sort of continues to deconstruct or dismantle the system we created and adapted over 70 years, the world could look a lot more like the world of 1900, but with a different set of actors. So around 1900, you had a series of great powers, primarily European, including Russia, but also sort of Japan. The United States was a rising power in that system. And in the current area, you would probably have the United States with some North American dimension. You'd have China. You'd have the European Union on economics, not necessarily on political security issues. Russia, because of its geographic position and some of its sort of perhaps its role in the energy sector. Japan with a complex relationship with the United States and with China to be determined. That world is very different than the world that Peter and I operated in or that you've studied. And it's got a lot of costs and risks. Think about what happened in the world of 1900 come sort of 1914. And it certainly means that the mid-sized powers of the world, which have benefited from the framework and rules of the system been created, they would live in a much more difficult environment. You'd probably have more spheres of influence, where Asia would be more dominated by China. The United States would have its region, Europe would have its. So these go to the point that I tried to close my opening remarks with, which is that, just keep in mind, we've lived in destabilized eras before. The 20th century history was that story. So while nothing stays the same, let's not take for granted the system that the United States helped build. And a lot of those countries today, and I saw this in the World Bank, I saw it in US diplomacy, they may not always agree with the United States, but they got at least comfortable with the notion that the United States would be the key player when there was a crisis to identify the problem and try to come up with some set of solutions. They may not have always liked it. They may have differentiated themselves 10 degrees, 15 degrees, other points, but it was a stabilizing force in a dynamic system. And that's the question we'll have for the future.
Our next question is from Jay Sullivan. Jay Sullivan.
Thank you for your time today. Turning the topic a little bit, I'm wondering, having been the president of the World Bank during the last global economic crisis, what approaches and perspectives you would recommend that international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, as well as I think in the long run, the US government might take to support developing nations in the recovery from the current pandemic?
Well, thanks, Jay. I touched on this a little bit in a piece I published in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. So if you're interested, you can look more at that. But let's start with this point. Emerging market countries are really going to get hit bad by this. If you think about what the US is doing, the Federal Reserve has taken extraordinary steps on monetary policy. Congress just expended $2 trillion and there'll be more. A lot of developing countries don't have the monetary space or the fiscal policy space. In fact, as the International Institute of Finance has revealed, since late January, about $100 billion of money has come out of developing countries because of the uncertainty. Their exchange rates have come down, which makes it even harder to sort of have a loose monetary policy. In sub-Saharan Africa, many of these countries do not have the public healthcare systems. The types of steps that developed countries are taking, such as social distancing and other rules, how will those apply in countries where you don't have the space and room to do that? So we'll see that there are younger populations in general. That's a plus, given what we know about the coronavirus. But Bill Gates said, I think on the NewsHour a couple of days ago, something I agree with. I'm afraid a lot of people are going to die in this process. Now, are there things that one can do? Definitely, and this goes to another big picture point. In the 2008, 2009, 2010 financial crisis, people can properly go back and analyze and criticize what was done right, what was done wrong. But this G20 grouping, a loose grouping, played an important role with the help of countries and these international institutions. Gordon Brown, who was then the Prime Minister of Britain, organized a London Economic Conference in the spring of 2009. It was very important in consolidating steps that countries could take, whether it was on trade or whether it was take on money for expenditures, trying to help the most vulnerable. And for those of you that do study history, it was a sharp contrast with the London Economic Conference of 1933 and during the Great Depression, which was seen as a failure. If you look at the world today, the Saudis are the chair of the G20. You can ask yourself what you expect on that. But more importantly, the key countries are not really stepping up, including the United States, to shape this agenda. Now, the development institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, have put out some of the ideas about how they want to try to expend the various funds, make it available. There'll be a big issue here that invokes China again, which is that a number of the developing countries have debt that they're going to have a difficult time paying. So you probably would want to try to have some payment moratorium, maybe even sort of debt restructuring or forgiveness. And a lot of the Chinese debt has been non-transparent. This is a good example of what Peter and I were talking about before. When I was still going to China before the coronavirus, I identified this issue as one that was going to blow up on China someday. And I urged them to get ahead of it. I suspect now they'll recognize that was good advice. And there'll be pressure on China to sort of ease off some of these debts. So there are also a series of issues related, for example, to trade barriers or trade finance. This was a big issue. Again, to give you a practical example, in 2009, after the banking regulators tried to shut the door, the barn after the horse had left, they were pulling a lot of the banks, requiring them to build their capital, cut off various lending. And they applied a formula that really would have cut off trade finance, which really would have hurt the developing countries in particular. And frankly, I at the World Bank and the head of the World Trade Organization worked with a lot of those institutions to press the Bank for International Settlements, which was sort of the bank's regulator in chief, to kind of adjust the standards for trade finance so we didn't cut those players off. So what I'm partly trying to represent is when you have a crisis like this, you have certain institutional capacities, you have certain national capacities. You need to have some group that helps pull this together, but certain countries have to play the lead. There's also, however, a lot of small points. It's one of trade finance that I've mentioned. There's a professor at Columbia named Adam Tooze that wrote a book called Deluge about post-World War I. He wrote one Crashed, which is sort of a first economic history look after the financial crisis. I differ with him on some points, but it's a pretty good piece. One that he identified that fortunately we've been able to follow up on is he identified the importance of the Federal Reserve's dollar swap lines, without getting into the complexity of this, how important it was when there was a shortage of dollars. And if you notice, the Federal Reserve actually activated that again promptly, and they came up with a creative approach to allow countries such as emerging markets that had treasuries to basically create repo loans against them. So I compliment the Federal Reserve for doing this. Frankly, it was one of the tools that I was somewhat worried, say a year ago, that if we got into a crisis, the Trump administration might cut off. So it's important to understand the mechanics as well as the high politics.
So our next question is from Raul. Raul.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. I can hear you.
Hey, thank you so much for being here. My question is kind of similar to Jay's, but it's a little bit broader, looking at foreign aid and international development in general. I guess, where do you stand on the traditional debate between the Jeffrey Sachs school of, we need to pour money in and develop, and the Easterly school of, we need to work on local capacity building. So going off of that, how can institutions like the World Bank, as well as governments in the US and across industrialized countries, make sure that their development aid is being used most effectively?
So in the limited time available, I'm smiling because I know I've heard Bob wax eloquent on this subject, but in just the limited time, what would you say, Bob?
Well, let me take it in two parts. One, there's been a lot of hard lessons learned in the development field about how one needs to combine aid or public sector money with good governance, anti-corruption, rule of law, incentives for private sector investment. Whatever aid money comes in, or whether World Bank loans of different types, it's a drop in the bucket compared to local savings and the type of investment environment that a country creates. And You can see that in the development prospects. And so if you try to put those two poles, I think the reality is kind of a messy in between. And at the end of the day, development doesn't work unless the local country owns it. So it does depend on their politics. A good thing is that over the past decades, lots of developing countries have examples from other developing countries. 30 or 40 years ago, they were trying to compare themselves with Europe or the US or Japan. And Japan did create an export-led growth model. But there's a rich experience out there now that sort of governance can try to focus on. That's a brief thing of the broader story. But since you focused on the crisis of today, I'll just give you the example. When I was at the World Bank, I put my foot on the pedal of making funds and liquidity available, tried to do it in a way that made sure that we knew where the money was going and with the sort of the proper governance. But I think it's incumbent on those institutions in a crisis period to really try to step up. And so far, the IMF and World Bank have said signs of doing that. The question is whether they'll be backed. Ultimately, they're owned by the developed countries. The developed countries provide a lot of the funding basis of it. And so at the end of the day, I personally think developed countries also need to recognize that if the developing countries are in crisis or don't recover, that's going to hurt the developed countries' ability to come out of this as well. So, part of my theme for you, I guess, is when you sometimes hear nationalism against internationalism, stop for a minute and recognize there's a lot of self-interest that can be served by devising the right mutual interests.
So the audience may not know this about Bob, but you operate in two worlds. You operate in the world of high finance, advising global leaders, captains of industry around the world. But you also are an avid naturalist and active in the conservation movement and a birder. And one of your challenges is you have two totally separate wardrobes for those ventures. But I am going to give you something that would work in both. This is the AGS t-shirt. And this, if you wear it while birding, you will be at home in the woods. But if you wear this while you're negotiating with the captains of industry, it will strike fear in their hearts and give you leverage over them. So we will send this to you because we're very much in your debt, Bob, for all you've given us. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Bob. Thank you.
Well, and Peter, the key thing for you to note is, I'm glad it wasn't white, because as a birder, you would know that birds react negatively to white.
Exactly. No, this is dark blue, and you'll blend in. We have to. All right. Thank you all, and we are dismissed. Thank you.
Pleased to be with you.